The first time the Galactic Council issued a termination notice, they did it without ceremony. No warning, no negotiation. Just a single data packet, compressed into a tight beam of quantum light, fired across 14 light-years of empty space toward the third planet of a small, unremarkable yellow star. The packet landed in 17 different radio telescopes simultaneously at 3:42 in the morning, Greenwich Mean Time, on a Tuesday in March. Most of the operators on duty that night assumed it was interference. One of them, a young woman named Dr. Priya Nair working at the Pune Observatory in India, did not. She stared at the pattern on her screen for 6 straight minutes before she picked up her phone and called her supervisor. By morning, the signal had been confirmed at 4 independent stations. By noon, it was on the desks of 7 different heads of state. By midnight, the entire planet knew. The message was not hard to translate. It was, in fact, almost insultingly simple. The Galactic Council had apparently anticipated that the target species would be primitive enough to require basic language, and so they had included a cipher built from universal mathematics, prime sequences, and binary visual maps. Within 72 hours, a team of linguists, mathematicians, and computer scientists working out of a converted warehouse in Geneva had cracked it completely. The translation was reviewed, checked, and checked again. Then it was read aloud in a closed session of the United Nations Security Council. It said, Species designation Sol, 3. Classification, pre-stellar, carbon-based, aggressive. Threat assessment, escalating. By authority of the Galactic Council, Directive 7 has been initiated. Sector clearance will begin in 90 standard cycles. Cooperation is neither required nor expected. This notice is provided as a matter of record only. 90 standard cycles translated to roughly 4 Earth years, 3 months, and 11 days. The Council had not told humanity what Directive 7 meant in practical terms. They did not need to. Every civilization in the galaxy already knew. Directive 7 was the final step in a long bureaucratic process that ended with a target world being sterilized from orbit. Not destroyed, not colonized, just cleaned. Like wiping bacteria off a countertop before preparing a meal. The panic that followed was not the screaming, running kind shown in old disaster films. It was quieter and in many ways worse. Governments did not collapse immediately. Markets did not crash in a single day. People still went to work, still fed their children, still argued about small things. But underneath everything, a kind of stillness settled over the planet. A heaviness. The kind that comes when you understand that something has already been decided about you by someone far more powerful, and that your opinion on the matter was never part of the equation. Within a week, every major space agency on Earth had redirected every available resource toward a single question. What exactly is the Galactic Council, and what can we do about it? Satellites were repositioned. Classified programs were declassified overnight. 7 different nations shared intelligence data that had never been shared before. It was, in its way, the most united humanity had ever been. Which was, as more than one commentator noted bitterly, excellent timing. Dr. Priya Nair, who had started all of this with one phone call, was now working 18-hour days as part of a joint research team housed in an underground facility outside of Oslo. Her job was signal analysis, specifically trying to determine whether the original transmission contained anything beyond the primary message. A footnote, a loophole, anything. She was not optimistic, but she was thorough, and she was stubborn, and on the 31st day after first contact, she found something. It was buried in the noise layer of the transmission, the part that most analysts had discarded as static. To the naked eye, or to any standard decryption algorithm, it looked like nothing. But Priya had a habit of looking at data the way a sculptor looked at raw stone, not for what was there, but for what might be hiding inside. She ran the noise through a spectral filter she had written herself, designed to isolate recursive patterns in apparent randomness. At 2:17 in the morning, the filter returned a result. It was a second message, smaller, coded differently, far more carefully hidden, and unlike the first, it had not been sent by the Galactic Council. The sender signature, when Priya finally isolated it, corresponded to no known species in the Council's own directory, which meant it had been added by someone operating outside official channels, someone who had somehow intercepted the original transmission and piggybacked a second one onto it without the Council ever knowing. The message itself was only 11 words long in translation, but those 11 words were enough to change everything that came after. It read, "Do not respond. Do not broadcast. Find the Vorith. They know the way." Priya sat alone in the dim light of her workstation for a long time after reading it. Outside the facility, the Norwegian winter was dark and absolute. She was aware that the moment she reported this, nothing would ever be simple again. The Council's message had been a death sentence handed down by a court that didn't recognize humanity's right to appeal. But this second message, this hidden, careful, anonymous whisper pressed into the static, was something else entirely. It was the sound of someone, somewhere in the vast machinery of the galaxy, taking a risk they didn't have to take. It was, she realized, the first sign that humanity might not be entirely alone in not wanting to die. She picked up her phone. She called her supervisor. And for the second time in 31 days, Dr. Priya Nair started something she could not possibly finish alone. The Vorith were not easy to find, which was apparently the point. Every reference to them in the Council's own transmission data, and there were only 4, described them in terms that combined administrative language with something that sounded very much like contempt. They were listed as a species of uncertain classification, nomadic, non-compliant, and flagged under a Council status designation that translated roughly as persistent nuisance. They had no seat on the Council. They had no registered home system. They had been issued 14 separate citations for interference with Council directives over the past 600 years and had paid none of them. To the Galactic Council, the Vorith were the galaxy's most irritating loose end. To humanity, looking at this data in an underground facility outside Oslo, they sounded like exactly the right people to call. The problem was how to call them without broadcasting. The hidden message had been clear on that point. Any transmission detectable by the Council would accelerate the timeline, possibly dramatically. The Galactic Council had deep-range monitoring capabilities that made Earth's most advanced surveillance systems look like 2 tin cans connected by string. Whatever humanity did next, it had to be quiet. It had to be invisible. And it had to happen fast, because the 90-cycle clock was running and it did not care about human difficulties. Commander COJ-1 had been a deep space mission specialist for 11 years before any of this happened. She had spent 3 of those years on a long-duration research station at the edge of the solar system, studying interstellar medium density, which was exactly as quiet and unglamorous as it sounded. She was, by her own description, the least dramatic person in any room. She had been selected for the Vorith mission precisely because she was unlikely to panic, unlikely to improvise recklessly, and unlikely to say something that would accidentally start an interstellar incident. Her crew of 6 had been chosen along similar lines. They were not heroes. They were professionals, which in this situation was considerably more useful. The ship they were given had no name when they boarded it. Someone had painted a small number on the side in white stencil, a designation from the Emergency Joint Construction Program that had built it in 11 weeks out of components from 3 different nations' space programs. J1 named it herself, standing in the loading bay 2 hours before departure, with a marker she borrowed from the cargo team. She wrote stubborn in English and then, after a moment, wrote it again in Korean below. It seemed appropriate. They left without ceremony. No launch broadcast. No crowd. The global communications blackout that had been maintained since Priya's discovery meant that roughly 4 billion people knew something significant was happening, but not what. The other 3 billion were either operating under government information restrictions or living in areas where the information infrastructure had not yet caught up. Either way, the Stubborn and its crew of 7 climbed out of Earth's atmosphere on a quiet Thursday morning and were gone before anyone outside the program knew they had launched. Finding the Vorith required following a chain of inference rather than a direct signal. The Council's own records, combined with astrophysical data that Priya's team had spent 3 weeks cross-referencing, pointed to a region of space between 2 uninhabited star systems where the Vorith had been detected, or rather, where the effects of their presence had been detected, on multiple occasions across the past century. It was not an address. It was more like a general neighborhood. A vast, cold, largely empty neighborhood spanning several hundred cubic light-years. J1 looked at the projected search area on her navigation screen on the 3rd day out and said, very quietly, that finding anyone in that volume of space was going to be like finding a specific grain of sand on a specific beach on a planet you'd never visited. Her navigator, a Bolivian physicist named Tomás Quispe, who had a gift for understatement, replied that technically they weren't looking for just any grain of sand. They were looking for a grain of sand that had previously wanted to be found by species in exactly their situation. The distinction, he said, mattered. Jae-won thought about that for a moment and decided he was right, which was a more comfortable thought than the alternative. On the 19th day, the stubborn's passive sensors picked up a gravitational irregularity that didn't match any natural object in the catalogs. It was small, subtle, the kind of thing a less careful crew would have logged as instrument noise and moved on. But Jae-won had briefed her people extensively on the Vorth's reputation for evasion, and so instead of moving on, they stopped. They held position. They did not broadcast anything. They waited. For 6 hours, nothing happened. Then, without any transition that the sensors could measure, a ship was simply there. It had not arrived. It had not decloaked in any dramatic sense. One moment the space ahead of them was empty, and the next moment it was not. The ship was long and dark and covered in structures that human engineering vocabulary didn't have good words for. Not engines exactly, not weapons exactly, not antennae exactly, but something that seemed to serve some combination of all three functions simultaneously. It was also considerably larger than the stubborn, which Jae-won noted calmly and filed away. No transmission came. Instead, something happened to the screens inside the stubborn. Text appeared directly on every display aboard simultaneously, without going through any of the ship's communication systems, which should not have been possible. It was in English. Jae-won would later wonder about that, whether the Vorth had simply pulled the language from their systems the moment they appeared, or whether they had been watching Earth long enough to learn it another way. She never got a satisfying answer. The text said, "You are the fourth species we have done this for. The other three are still alive. We will speak. Come aboard. Leave your fear on your ship. You will not need it here, and it will only slow us down." Jae-won read it twice. Then she turned to her crew and asked if anyone had a strong objection to going aboard an alien vessel on the basis of a message that had bypassed every security system they had. No one did. She unbuckled her harness, floated to the airlock, and pressed the cycle button. Behind her, 6 people did the same, one after another, without being asked twice. That, she thought, was the thing about sending professionals. When it mattered, they moved. The interior of the Vorth ship was not what any of them had expected, and they had tried very hard not to expect anything specific. It was warm, first of all, which surprised Jae-won more than the architecture, though the architecture was surprising enough. The corridors were tall and slightly curved, the walls covered in a material that shifted color slowly in response to movement nearby. Not dramatically, not like a screen, more like the way water changes shade when the light angle shifts. The gravity was close to Earth normal, slightly lighter, pleasant in the way that a good day feels pleasant. Nothing you could point to exactly, just an overall rightness. Their guide, if that was the right word, was waiting for them inside the airlock. It was tall, perhaps 2.5 meters, with a body plan that was bilaterally symmetrical but organized differently than a human body. The proportions were different, the joints were different. The face, if the forward-facing cluster of sensory structures could be called a face, was different in ways that took some adjustment. But the way it held itself was readable, patient, curious, slightly amused in a way that came through even across the gap of completely alien biology. It introduced itself, through the same direct-to-screen text method, as Vel, and specified that this was a use name, the closest approximation of a Vorth personal designation that their translation system could render without causing headaches. Vel brought them to a room that had clearly been prepared for human visitors. There were seats scaled to human proportions. There was a table. There were no decorations, but the lighting was tuned to a spectrum that felt natural and easy on human eyes, and Jae-won recognized with a small shock that the temperature in the room was almost exactly 21 degrees Celsius, which was what most humans considered comfortable. The Vorth had done their homework. The conversation that followed lasted 11 hours, with breaks. It was the most important conversation in the history of the human species, and most of it was deeply technical, which is how the most important things often work. Vel explained, with patience and without condescension, how the Galactic Council operated. It was not, as some humans had imagined, a council of wise elders governing the galaxy for the greater good. It was an administrative body, ancient and slow and enormously powerful, that had been managing interstellar space for so long that its original purpose had become buried under millennia of procedure. The directives it issued, including Directive 7, were not acts of malice. They were acts of bureaucracy, which was in some ways worse, because bureaucracy did not feel guilt and could not be appealed to on moral grounds. Directive 7 specifically existed because the Council had, across its long history, seen what happened when aggressive prestellar species were allowed to develop unchecked and reach interstellar capability. Twice, in the Council's recorded history, the result had been catastrophic. Those two events had shaped Council policy for hundreds of thousands of years. The humans sitting in that room, Vel said, were not being targeted because they were evil. They were being targeted because they fit a statistical profile, and the Council did not distinguish between the profile and the individual case. It never had. It was not designed to. But, Vel continued, and this was the part that made J1's engineer, a Finnish woman named Aino Mäkinen, lean forward sharply. There was a procedure. There had always been a procedure. Buried deep inside the Council's own charter, written in the founding documents by species who had long since gone extinct, was a provision called the Vorith Clause. Not because the Vorith had written it, because they had been the ones, across 600 years of persistent nuisance activity, who had refused to let it be forgotten. The clause stated that any species under a Directive 7 order had the right to present evidence of cognitive and moral complexity before an arbitration panel, provided they could identify a sponsoring species to file the motion, and provided the motion was filed within the notice period. The Council had never expected it to be used. The notice period was deliberately short. The sponsoring species requirement was deliberately difficult. No established Council member would risk the political cost of sponsoring a condemned species. And the evidence requirements were deliberately vague, which meant the Council's arbitration panel had wide latitude to reject almost anything. Almost anything. Not everything. The Vorith had found the 3 exceptions in 600 years of looking, and they had refined the approach each time. They knew what the Council's arbitration panel could not easily dismiss. They knew the specific categories of evidence that had weight under the original charter language. And they had, over those 600 years, developed something that no Council regulation had ever managed to prohibit: a methodology. A way of helping a condemned species make the case for its own survival, built from everything the Vorith had learned across 3 previous attempts. J1 listened to all of this without interrupting, which took considerable self-control. When Vel finished, she asked 3 questions. First, what was the success rate? Vel answered, 3 for 3, though the most recent case had been close. Second, what did humanity need to provide? Vel's answer to this was long and specific, and Aino was taking notes furiously before it was half finished. Third, why were the Vorith doing this at all? What did they get out of 600 years of fighting a bureaucracy that held no formal power over them? Vel was quiet for a moment before answering the third question, which was the only time during the 11 hours that J1 sensed something that might have been genuine emotion in the alien's manner. Then the text appeared on the screens, because the Council's first 2 cases were not catastrophic because the species were dangerous. They were catastrophic because no one helped them in time. We were there for the second one. We did not help. We have been correcting that decision ever since. The room was quiet for a long moment after that. Outside the ship's walls, the stars were cold and distant and indifferent. Inside, 7 humans sat with the weight of their planet on the table between them, and across from them, a being who had carried its own weight for longer than their civilization had been able to write things down, looked back at them, and waited. J1 exhaled slowly. Then she asked Vel to tell them exactly what they needed to do, and she took out her own notepad, because this was the part that mattered, and she had not been sent across 14 light-years of space to listen carefully and then fail to take notes. The arbitration chamber of the Galactic Council was not grand. That was the first thing J1 noticed when they were brought inside. She had expected something enormous, something built to impress, ceilings that disappeared into darkness, walls that communicated power through sheer scale. Instead, the room was modest, functional in the way that very old institutions often are, where the real authority has been operating for so long that it no longer feels the need to perform. The chamber was circular. The panel sat on a raised section of floor, not a dais, just a slightly elevated ring. There were 7 of them, representing 7 member species, and they were all very still in the way that beings who have sat in judgment for centuries learn to be still. Vel had filed the motion 4 weeks earlier, which had used up a significant portion of the remaining notice period. The council had acknowledged receipt without comment, which Vel had said was the standard response and not a negative sign. The arbitration date had been set automatically by the system, as required by the clause. All of this was procedure, and procedure, Vel had reminded them, was the only language the council truly spoke. You did not fight a bureaucracy with passion. You fought it with better paperwork. Humanity had spent those 4 weeks producing the best paperwork in its history. The evidence package that J1 and her crew had compiled with Vel's guidance was comprehensive in a way that only something produced under existential pressure can be. It was not a collection of humanity's greatest hits. Art, literature, philosophy, the standard things a species might reach for when trying to explain itself. Vel had been clear that the council's arbitration panel had seen all of those before and was not moved by them. What the panel was required, under the charter language, to weigh was evidence of systemic moral adaptation, not individual acts of goodness, not cultural achievements. Evidence that the species as a whole had demonstrated the capacity to recognize harm it caused, modify its behavior in response, and sustain those modifications across generations, even when doing so was costly, even when it went against immediate self-interest. This was, it turned out, a much harder case to make than listing great artists. It required evidence of a different kind. Data on the abolition of practices that had been profitable and culturally embedded, slavery, child labor, systematic exclusion, and the mechanisms by which those abolitions had been achieved and maintained. Records of international cooperation on environmental damage that species had caused to their own planet, including instances where nations had accepted economic costs to honor agreements that had no enforcement mechanism. Documentation of legal systems that had, over time, extended rights progressively further to people who had been excluded, to future generations, even, haltingly and imperfectly, to other species. Not because these systems were perfect, not because the progress was linear or sufficient, but because the pattern existed, and the pattern was what the clause required. There was also a category that Vel had described as uniquely difficult to document, but potentially the most persuasive. Evidence that the species had modified its behavior in response to ethical reasoning alone, without external enforcement, in cases where defection would never have been detected. Humans had argued about whether such evidence even existed until Ano had pointed out, somewhat drily, that it existed in enormous quantity. It was just distributed across billions of individual decisions that no one had ever thought to compile, because on Earth, they had simply been called ordinary decency. The presentation before the panel lasted 4 hours. J1 delivered it herself, standing at the center of the circular chamber with a display system the Vorith had provided. Reading from notes, she had gone over so many times that she barely needed them. She spoke clearly and without drama, because Vel had advised that drama was counterproductive before this panel. The council's arbitration members did not want to be moved. They wanted to be satisfied. There was a difference, and understanding it was the difference between failure and the other thing. When she finished, the panel asked questions. The questions were careful and technical and showed that at least some of the members had read the evidence package in detail, which Vel had privately told her was unusual. Most species packages were dismissed at the preliminary stage. The fact that they had reached live questioning at all was, by historical standards, already something. J1 answered every question directly. When she did not know something, she said so and indicated where the documentation addressed the related point. She did not speculate. She did not argue. She presented. Her hands, she noticed distantly, were completely steady. The panel withdrew to deliberate. Vel had said deliberations could take anywhere from 1 hour to 6 days, depending on how divided the panel was. They were gone for 9 hours. When they returned, and the senior arbitration member, a being whose species name in the translated record was rendered simply as eldest, began to speak, the chamber was so quiet that J1 was aware of her own heartbeat. The eldest's voice came through the translation system as something flat and toneless, which was a deliberate feature of the system, designed to prevent emotional coloring from influencing interpretation. The words it produced were formal and structured in the way of council language, full of references to charter provisions and precedent designations that meant nothing to Jawan except insofar as they were the mechanism by which her planet would live or die. She listened carefully through 5 minutes of procedural framing, and then the eldest reached the ruling. The panel had found, by a vote of 5-2, that the species of Sol 3 had demonstrated sufficient evidence of systemic moral adaptation to satisfy the threshold requirements of the Vorith Clause. Directive 7 was hereby suspended pending a monitoring period of 50 standard cycles. At the conclusion of the monitoring period, the Council would review. The species would be assigned a developmental classification that granted provisional status within the galactic community, not membership, not recognition, but the right to exist without a clearance order. The decision was final. The motion was closed. J1 stood very still for a moment after the translation finished. Then she thanked the panel, because Vel had told her to always thank the panel regardless of outcome. And she walked back to where her crew was standing along the chamber wall, and none of them said anything for a while, because there was too much to say and the words hadn't arrived yet. On the journey home, Vel asked her once, in the quiet of the ship's common area, what she intended to tell her planet. J1 thought about it for a long time. They had been given a suspended sentence, not an acquittal. They had 50 cycles to demonstrate, under observation, that the evidence they had presented was not merely historical but ongoing. That was a different kind of pressure than a death sentence, but it was still pressure. It was, she thought, the most reasonable possible outcome for a species being asked to prove it deserved to survive. She told Vel that she intended to tell her planet the truth, that they had won something, but winning was the beginning, not the end. That the galaxy was watching now, and humanity would have to decide what it wanted to be while being watched. That 50 cycles was enough time to do something real if they chose to, and not enough time to hide anything if they didn't. Vel processed this, and then produced a text response that appeared on the small screen between them. It said, the other 3 species said similar things. 2 of them meant it. J1 nodded slowly. Outside the viewport, the stars were the same stars that had hung above every human who had ever looked up and wondered if they were alone. They had an answer to that now, which was complicated and imperfect and not at all what anyone had imagined. She thought that was probably appropriate. The best answers usually were. She turned away from the window, picked up the notepad she had been carrying since the Vorith ship, and started writing. There was a lot to record, and she wanted to get it right, because this was the part of the story that belonged to everyone, and everyone deserved to know exactly how it had gone.